people, a dictatorship that crushes the resistance of the exploiting classes, who are opposing the organization of socialist construction in the countries of people's democracy. At the very same time, the revolutionary power of the people is a genuine democracy for the working class and the toilers, who for the very first time, received a guarantee of political freedom and an actual improvement of their living standards. Lenin has more than once pointed out that the transition from capitalism to socialism, taken on a world scale, shows a diversity of forms of democracy and forms of transition from capitalism to socialism. In 1921, Lenin noted that other countries which follow the USSR in the path to socialism bring in many of their own specific features in the fight for socialism. Above all, they are not called upon to begin the attack on imperialism and pierce the first breach in its system. In comparing the RSFSR with the Soviet Republic of Transcaucasia, which had just arisen in 1920, Lenin wrote, "We have made the first breach in world capitalism. A breach has been made. We have maintained our positions after a fierce, superhuman, severe, difficult and painfully intense war against the whites, the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, who were supported by the whole of the Entente, by its blockade and by its military assistance. You, comrades, communists of the Caucasus, have no need to force a breach. Take advantage of the favorable international situation that exists for you in 1921, and learn to create the new conditions with greater caution and more methodically. In 1921, neither Europe nor the whole world is what it was in 1917 and 1918. Lenin pointed out further that the Transcaucasian republics rely upon the military and political assistance of the RSFSR, while Soviet Russia in the first years of its existence was not able to receive such assistance and consequently met with great difficulties. Lenin, however, emphasized that in spite of all the specific conditions in the Soviet republics of Transcaucasia, the spirit, the sense, and the lessons of the experience of the Russian communists ought to be fully studied by the communists of Transcaucasia. The directives of Lenin are of great theoretical and fundamental importance. They serve to guide us in the analysis of the processes that are taking place in the countries of people's democracy. It is, of course, necessary to study the specific conditions in the countries of people's democracy which have in the past been developing under conditions different to those existing in the borderlands of the Russian Empire. And besides, the correlation of forces in the international field are today completely different to those which existed in 1920-21. In the light of these circumstances, the brilliance of the directives of V. I. Lenin, who even in 1921 emphasized that in spite of all the specific conditions in every country, in spite of the diversity of forms of the transition to socialism, it is essential to study the experience of the Russian communists, stands out even more convincingly and clearly. These directives of Lenin assume special significance under present conditions. People's democracy in the lands of Eastern and Central arose on the basis of the cooperation of the peoples of these countries with the great Soviet Union, which had built up socialism and which rendered them guiding assistance. Without the existence of the Soviet Union, which defeated Hitlerite imperialism and its satellites, without the USSR that stands as an example to the world of the possibility of administering a country without the landlords and the capitalists, the birth of people's democracy in the form that it took place would have been impossible. The Soviet Union was the moral and political, the economic and the military support of the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe, who had risen to fight fascism and had taken power into their own hands. The Soviet Union saved these countries from foreign intervention, planned as a civil war on the Greek model. Between 1917-20, the peoples of the Soviet Union made the first breach in the imperialist system and defended their socialist fatherland from the imperialist attempts to smother it. Between 1941-45, the USSR, a socialist state, defeated the German aggressors, smashed the forces of fascism in Europe and at the same time, made possible the emergence of people's democracy in the lands of Eastern and Central Europe. The existence of a mighty revolutionary force, the Soviet Army, in these countries prevented the bourgeoisie from restoring the old apparatus of state power, that had been smashed as a result of the defeat of fascism. It also constituted an obstacle to direct Anglo-American imperialist intervention in the internal affairs of these countries, and it helped the workers to capture political power. Such conditions did not exist for the working class of those countries where the imperialist armies had entered. Thus the victorious Red Army pierced a new breach in the system of world imperialist forces and created a new powerful support in the anti-imperialist front. Based on this victory, there arose a new, revolutionary power led by the working class, a new democracy, carrying out the functions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not only the victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War but the very fact of the existence of the mighty socialist state, the USSR, conditioned the appearance of the People's Democratic States and determined the possibility of socialist construction in these countries. The leader of the United Workers' Party of Poland, Comrade Beirut, was profoundly correct when he spoke in this connection in his report to the Unity Congress of the Workers' Parties of Poland. He said, "Thus just as at the basis of our people's democracy lies the selfless heroic help of the Soviet Union, the basis of a distinctive feature of our path, compared with the Soviet Union rests on the all-round help of the Soviet Uni 0N and on the Utilisatel 0N of the experience and achievements of the victorious dictatorship of the proletariat, thanks to which we within the framework of people's democracy, are able, in our way, to realize the functions of the dictatorship of the proletariat." The dictatorship of the proletariat is the forcible coercion of the exploiters, but the forms of this coercion can and will be inevitably different. In the country that first ushered in the era of socialist revolution, the proletariat, since it did not rely on the state support of the proletariat of any other country, had inevitably to bear the brunt of the most furious attack not only of its own but of the world's bourgeoisie. Under these conditions the overthrown bourgeoisie boycotted the state of the new power and fought them with ferocity. It is enough to remember the ire of the Russian bourgeoisie against the Soviets and its struggle in order to be convinced about this. It was the unscrupulous, self-seeking and sordid fight of the bourgeoisie waged against the Soviets. And lastly, it was the overt participation of the bourgeoisie in the Kornilov mutiny, that paved the way for the formal exclusion of the bourgeoisie from the Soviets, wrote Lenin. This rendered inevitable the restriction of franchise for the bourgeoisie in the USSR in the first stages of the development of the dictatorship of the proletariat. With regard to this, Lenin emphasized the fact that the question of restricting the franchise is a nationally specific and not a general question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that in the USSR these limitations arose as a result of the specific conditions of the Russian Revolution, the specific path of its development, and that the restriction of franchise for the bourgeoisie is not absolutely necessary for the exercise of the dictatorship. It is not an essential earmark of the logical concept dictatorship, it does not enter as an essential condition in the historical and class concept dictatorship. The necessary earmark, the essential condition of dictatorship, is the forcible suppression of the exploiters as a class, and, consequently, the infringement of pure democracy, i.e., of equality and freedom for that class. It is on the one hand, the distinctive features of the internal development in a country, the correlation of class forces and the intensity of class conflicts in the country, and on the other the distinctive features of the international situation which, above all, determine the forms, methods and the scale of the violence of the proletariat against the exploiters. For the working class violence is not an aim but a means of coercing the resistance of the bourgeoisie and strengthening the workers' state. The measure of this violence is determined in the main by the measure of bourgeois resistance and by the extent of its fury in the struggle against the proletariat and the toiling classes as a whole. As Comrade Dimitrov points out in his report to the Fifth Congress of the Bulgarian Workers' Party, the regime of people's democracy must smash the resistance of the capitalists and the big landholders and organize the building up of industry on the foundations of social ownership and planned economy. In order to achieve this, it is necessary not only to crush the capitalist elements and to eliminate whatever attempts are made to restore the power of the capitalists and landlords, but also to overcome the instability of the petty bourgeoisie and the middle peasantry, and to rally the greater masses of the toilers around the working class for a determined struggle in the transition to socialism. The fundamental task of people's democracy in the building of a socialist society consists in the creation of such conditions for the well-being and the culture of the popular masses as are allowed by contemporary science and by the existing possibilities of the country. But it is impossible to build up socialism without raising the level of the productive forces both in the town and in the countryside. As the experience of socialist construction in the USSR has shown, a firm guarantee of the welfare of the peasants and of the growth of agriculture are possible only under conditions of collective economy and realizable in the form of productive cooperation. The restriction and the squeezing out of capitalist elements is the indispensable condition for the cooperation of peasant farms and the complete elimination of capitalist elements. The concrete forms of this cooperation will be entirely determined by the conditions that exist in the countries of people's democracy. And in particular the process of collectivizing peasant farms must decide the problem of socialization not only of the instruments of labor but also of land, inasmuch as land has not been nationalized in these countries. This undoubtedly is what in essence distinguishes the conditions of collectivization of peasant farms in the lands of people's democracy from the conditions in which it proceeded in the USSR and creates a number of additional difficulties for these countries. There is no doubt left that the working class which constitutes the leading force in the countries of people's democracy after having overcome the disruption in its ranks and rallied around united communist parties is now finding the path and the means of overcoming these difficulties and speedily carrying out the task of socialist reconstruction of agriculture on the path to collectivization. Everything that has been said about the regime of people's democracy testifies to the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat has been consolidated, a dictatorship which is an instrument of coercing the exploiters, an instrument of communist transformation, and communist re-education of the working class, and a weapon for the elimination of classes and building up of socialism. As in the USSR, the highest principle of this dictatorship is the alliance of the working class and the peasantry, realized under the leadership of the working class. The world historical development of the countries of people's democracy and in particular, the experience of their struggle for socialism has once more confirmed the correctness of the great Lenin, who already on the eve of the Great October Revolution wrote, "The transition from capitalism to socialism will certainly create a great variety and abundance of political forms, but their essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat." The dictatorship of the proletariat in the countries of people's democracy was established in a special form as distinct from Soviet one. It was carried out in the form of a people's democratic republic. The following distinctive features in the historical situation gave rise to such a possibility. First, the existence of the Soviet Union, a mighty socialist state whose armed forces destroyed Hitlerite Germany, and at the same time, brought about the defeat of fascist regimes both in Germany and in the countries of its occupation. The victory of the Soviet Union could not but lead to the destruction, the smashing up of the old fascicized apparatus of state power in the countries that had been liberated by the Soviet army from the Hitlerite yoke. This victory created the conditions for the transfer of power to the hands of the people. The anti-fascist struggle of the popular masses, led by working class, received a powerful impetus to its development, and the role of the working class in the political life of the country increased tremendously as a result of the fight and the victory of the Soviet army. In the countries liberated by the Soviet army, the working class became the principal force in the political life. Under these circumstances, the remnants of fascism were eradicated and political life was democratized. The new state power that had been created in place of the old destroyed one was in form republican democratic. It was, however, created anew on real democratic foundations, under the leadership of the working class. The republican structure and its institutions had become not an instrument of the rule of the exploiters but an instrument of the domination of the popular masses, led by the working class. The bourgeoisie made a series of attempts to bring the new state under its control, to turn it into an ordinary bourgeois parliamentary state, but it did not dare to instigate a civil war and attempt at restoring its domination by bloody means. The defeat of Hitlerite Germany demoralized the bourgeoisie of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe. A considerable part of it, being compromised because of its ties with the Hitlerites, received the punishment it deserved at the hands of the people. The section that remained and its hangers-on found themselves without the apparatus of state power and were paralyzed by the presence of the Soviet army. They were, therefore, forced to give up any attempts at defeating the working class by armed means. The existence of the Soviet army saved the countries of people's democracy from armed intervention and prevented the imperialist states from carrying out an aggression. The bourgeoisie in the countries of people's democracy, being forced to renounce civil war, conducted a fierce struggle for reverting to the bourgeois parliamentary and even fascist structure. It established ties with the camp of imperialist reaction and above all, with imperialist circles in the USA and Britain. It carried on an unbridled campaign against the bloc of democratic parties and particularly against the leading force in this bloc, the Communist Party, and made desperate efforts to sow mischief between the Communist Party and other democratic parties and prevent the unification of the workers' parties, the Communist and Socialist, into united workers' parties. The bourgeois placed its agents in certain democratic parties and wove intrigues and conspiracies against the new, revolutionary power. It carried out terrorist acts, supported banditry and organized espionage at the behest of Anglo-American intelligence services, etc. Only a determined resistance to all the efforts of the bourgeoisie, its isolation from the petty bourgeoisie and particularly from the peasantry, the consolidation of the alliance of the working class and the peasantry, the overcoming of the disruption in the working class and the restoration of its leading role, the carrying out of the nationalization of big industry and the restriction of capitalist elements in agriculture and trade, all this secured the consolidation of the dictatorship of the working class in the countries of Eastern and Central Europe. Thus the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in these countries was not a swiftly accomplished act, but a comparatively long process that was completed at different times in different countries of people's democracy, a process that took place in conditions of intense struggle. The presence of the Soviet state and the Soviet army was the determining condition which guaranteed the relatively peaceful character of this struggle and its outcome in favor of the people led by the working class. It goes without saying, as Lenin more than once pointed out, that all boundaries in nature and society are conditional and mobile. However, it is possible for us to determine approximately when the dictatorship of the working class was consolidated in the various countries. In Czechoslovakia, the February events in 1948, when the working class and the peasantry defeated the attempts of reaction to take the movement backward, was one such boundary line. In Romania, it was the abolition of the monarchy. In Bulgaria, the defeat of the oppositionists and in essence the counter-revolutionary parties and groups, and particularly the Petkov group. In Hungary, the exposure of the counter-revolutionary elements in the smallholders' party, the ridding of this party of reactionary elements and the reconstruction of the National Front, etc. When we say that in the countries of Eastern and Central Europe the dictatorship of the proletariat was accomplished in the form of a People's Democratic Republic, it is important to bear in mind that this form was able to embody the dictatorship of the proletariat because of the existence of the dictatorship of the working class in the form of Soviet power in the USSR, the smashing of the bourgeois state apparatus in these countries, the change in parliamentary form necessitated by the experience of the Soviet state structure, the drawing in of mass organizations of workers into active participation in the work of state administration. Thus not only is the essence of the new revolutionary power opposed to the essence of the bourgeois parliamentary state, but even the form of administration of the people's democratic state has undergone a change compared to the parliamentary one. The state in the countries of people's democracy is a special form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, distinct from the Soviet one, is a people's democratic state. As Lenin and Stalin have pointed out, the Soviet power has been and remains the highest form of the socialist state. But the special path of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat in the countries of people's democracy, the correlation of forces inside these countries and the level of the political maturity of the working masses, as well as the balance of forces of socialism and imperialism on the international arena and the concrete forms of struggle for socialism of the working class of all countries, and finally, the leading role of the great Soviet Union, the standard-bearer of socialism and the consistent champion of democratic liberties. All this gave rise to conditions for establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in another form, in the form of a People's Democratic Republic. This special form of revolutionary power arose and proved capable of exercising the functions of the dictatorship of the proletariat and carrying out the tasks of a transitional period from capitalism to socialism, thanks to the presence and the help of the Soviet socialist state. Thus, people's democracy represents a special form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, arising under conditions of a new correlation of class forces on an international scale. This new form of power and the distinctive features of the development of the countries of people's democracy towards socialism, does not deny but only affirms the international significance of the Great October Socialist Revolution, the world historical significance of the successes of the USSR, its leading role in the struggle for communism. Moreover, the existence of the Soviet Union and its assistance also determines those distinctive features which were created in the countries of people's democracy. The course of history has once again confirmed the words of Lenin that the spirit, the sense and the lessons of the Russian communists are of permanent international importance. In the countries of people's democracy, every step made towards socialism is accomplished through a tenacious struggle against the forces and the traditions of the old world and takes place under conditions of a fierce class struggle. The experience of socialist construction in the USSR proves that this struggle is particularly stubborn when the socialist reconstruction of the countryside begins and when it comes to smashing the fierce resistance of the most numerous exploiting class, the class of kulaks. In regard to this, it must not be forgotten that the collectivization of peasant farms in the countries of people's democracy will be further complicated by the absence of land nationalization, a fact which, of course, the kulak will not fail to utilize. Struggle alone determines both the tempo of socialist construction as well as its success in the countries of people's democracy. All this demands from the workers' parties of the countries of people's democracy a further strengthening of people's power, and in particular a further consolidation of the leading role of the working class and its party, in the system of people's democracy. All this demands from them a careful study of the experience which the Soviet people and the Bolshevik party have accumulated in the struggle for socialism, and a further strengthening of the ties between their countries and other people's democracies and with the great Soviet Union. The Council of Mutual Economic Aid, designed to ensure the broad economic cooperation between these countries, plays a very big role in the assistance rendered by the Soviet Union to the people's democracies to carry out even more quickly the tasks of economic and cultural construction, and further strengthens the position of socialism and monocracy. Guided by the teachings of Lenin and Stalin on the dictatorship of the proletariat and on the path of building up socialism, and relying on the assistance of the Soviet Union, the countries of people's democracy have achieved significant successes in the development of national economy on the path to socialism and in the consolidation of the sovereignty of their states. It is only in Yugoslavia, where the clique of Tito, Gilos and Rankovic and other renegades betrayed Marxism-Leninism and turned traitor to the Soviet Union and the people's democracies, that the country has been led by this clique into an impasse. As a result of the treacherous actions of the foreign policy of Tito and the nationalists surrounding him, the workers of Yugoslavia have been deprived of all their achievements, which they gained in their heroic struggle against the German fascist oppressors. Tito's nationalist clique has broken with the anti-imperialist front and is attempting to harness the freedom-loving Yugoslav people to the yoke of Anglo-American imperialism and drag Yugoslavia into the imperialist and anti-democratic camp. The traitors and betrayers of the Yugoslav people will be answering before them as per their deserts for all these misdeeds. The birth of the people's democracies and the diversity of the tactics of the workers' parties in different countries that are carrying out socialist construction does not deny but confirms the historical experience of the Soviet Union and the experience of the world communist movement. They prove that the elimination of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the destruction of its state apparatus and the creation of a new type of state are the necessary conditions, the ultimate victory of communism. For in pointing T0 necessity of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, a power based on the use of force against the exploiters, Lenin pointed to the great practical advantages which the exploiters continue to enjoy for a long time after the revolution. Lenin wrote, "They still have money, some movable property, often fairly considerable, they still have various connections, habits of organization and management, knowledge of all the secrets of management, superior education, close connection with the higher technical personnel, incomparably greater experience in the art of war, and so on, and so forth." However, Lenin explained that the essence of the proletarian dictatorship does not lie in force alone. Lenin and Stalin teach us that the main and highest principle of a proletarian dictatorship is the alliance of the working class and the peasantry. In 1919, in a letter to the Hungarian workers who had set up Soviet power, Lenin wrote, "But the essence of the proletarian dictatorship does not lie in force alone, or even mainly in force. Its quintessence is the organization and discipline of the advanced detachment of the working people, of their vanguard, their sole leader, the proletariat, whose object is to build socialism, to abolish the division of society into classes, to make all members of society working people, to remove the basis for any kind of exploitation of man by man." In his works A Great Beginning and Economic and Politics in the Era of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, etc., Lenin described in detail the following. He pointed out that to rally behind it the whole mass of peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie on the path of new economic construction, new social relations, to convince the small proprietors of the advantages of large-scale socialist economy and to achieve their voluntary participation on the socialist path of development, to do all this means to solve the most complicated, the most difficult task of the revolution. Here by coercion, by naked administration, by jerks alone you will not achieve anything, only you will spoil the cause. It is necessary to carry out long, tedious, painstaking, systematically organized political and mass work amongst the peasantry and the petty bourgeois strata in the town. It is necessary to render state assistance and support to the growing cooperative enterprises. It is necessary to display widely the advantages of these cooperative enterprises, to rally the peasantry for a fight against the kulaks and the bourgeoisie in general. It is impossible to do all this without the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it is precisely because of this that the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot but be a form of the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. The dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin says, is a special form of class alliance between the proletariat, the vanguard of the toilers, and the numerous non-proletarian strata of toilers, the petty bourgeoisie, the small proprietors, the peasantry, the intelligentsia, etc. or the majority of these. It is an alliance against capital, an alliance aiming at the complete overthrow of capital, at the complete suppression of the resistance of the bourgeoisie and of any attempt on its part at restoration, an alliance aiming at the final establishment and consolidation of socialism.